In this video, we will be making a user authentication system in PHP from scratch using vanilla PHP with PDO and object-oriented programming. So here is what we'll have at the end of the video. Don't make a fuss over the styling of this project. I know that it isn't great, but since this is a PHP tutorial, the styling is less of a priority, and to save time we will start the tutorial with the style sheets already made. But as you can see, very simple application. There isn't actually anything that you can do on this application other than the authentication procedures, which are the focus of this tutorial. And as is expected of any authentication system, we are not currently signed in and we don't have an account, so we can click on this sign up to register a new account. Now all of our forms are validated on the back end, so we won't be able to proceed without passing basic security checks, like ensuring that we have completed all of the inputs and made sure that the passwords match, etc. Now, unlike other PHP tutorials that teach these types of form validation error messages, the version that we will be making in this tutorial are not persistent, meaning that they would disappear if we refresh the page. And for the sake of simplicity, I will set the password to simply be password. An extra security check will prevent us from submitting our registration form if either our username or email matches that of an already registered user, and our application knows this by querying the already registered users database, and as you can see, we've already got that email in the database, which is why we got the error. So great, we should now be registered, and we can check our database to see whether a new entry has been added or not. And as you can see, it has. So we should now be able to log into our account. And we can use our password along with either our username or email to log into our account. And it does not matter which we decide to use, they both work just fine. So we'll now fill out this information, making sure that it matches the data that we submitted when we registered our account. But take note of this forgotten password link, we will get to that in just a moment. And now that we are logged in, we get redirected back to the home page, where we are greeted with this message that now displays the form name that we submitted on the registration form instead of guest, which is what it said where we were an unauthenticated user. And just like how we signed in, we can now sign out as promised. The greeting message will change appropriately, and so does the navbar in fact. We will now demonstrate the forgotten password feature that will also be taught in this tutorial. So say if we are trying to log in but can't because we have forgotten our password, for example, well, we could click on this option and be taken to this form where we can submit the email that we want the forgotten password instructions to be sent to. Now that we have submitted our email, we could check our email's inbox for a password reset email. Note that we are using Mailtrap as our email server of choice for this tutorial, because it is very quick and easy to set up for testing purposes. So imagine that this is the inbox of the user who just typed in their email a moment ago. Well, we could see this new password reset email. Clicking on it, we could see that it contains a link that we can visit. If we follow the link, then we should be taken to a page on our application where the user can reset their password. Note that for security reasons, this password reset link will cease to function after a certain period of time, but since we have met that time frame, we will now reset our password. And now if we try to log in for old password, which was password, then it will not work. We will only be able to log in if we type in the most recent password after the change. Now it is worth mentioning that I created this tutorial because I was disappointed by the quality of PHP authentication tutorials already out there on the internet, in both video and article format. It seemed that you couldn't find a comprehensive tutorial that didn't have one major flaw. If they did write PHP code in an orderly fashion, using the streamlined MVC object-orientated pattern with PDO, a must for writing vanilla PHP applications that are maintainable, then they left out important functionality like a forgotten password feature, or they glossed over important details and the explanations were poor. If they were comprehensive and the explanations were serviceable, then chances are they wrote spaghetti code because they decided to write vanilla PHP code, which is notoriously unstructured in procedural programming, which led to a lot of copied and pasted code and projects that were all over the place and were just unmaintainable. This tutorial sets to put those problems to rest and produce a PHP authentication tutorial that is a quality reference for people who want to get their grips with PHP. Now we won't be producing a framework here, we will be producing the MVC pattern, but the preliminary work will be kept to a minimum. Therefore, this project isn't as structured as it could possibly be, but I think it would be fair to say that this is a huge improvement from a lot of the PHP authentication projects currently being taught out there on the internet. Oh, and by the way, the completed project's GitHub page will be posted in the description box below. The database won't work, but it is a good reference in case you get stuck at any point during this tutorial. So without further delay, let's now begin the tutorial. So here we are in the project that we will be working on throughout the length of this tutorial. As I mentioned before, we have already set up the styling and the markup, because covering that would detract from the tutorial's focus, and because this tutorial already assumes basic front-end skills. And before we begin, it is worth mentioning that I am using XAMPP to set up my PHP project, because it gives us an Apache server and MySQL database, both of which will be used in this tutorial. And because of this, our project is found within the htdocs folder of the XAMPP installation directory, because this is where all of our projects are hosted on the Apache local server, which, as you just saw, we have already started along with the MySQL server. Also, since we are working with PDO, it is necessary that we ensure that this line is present in the php.ini file in the PHP installation directory, and it's important that it doesn't have a semicolon at the start because we want to enable it so that we can use PDO. And on phpMyAdmin, which we should be able to access due to XAMPP, and we will create a new database, the database that our new project will use. So we'll call it login system YT because this is the YouTube version of the project which I've already tested out, and you saw that at the start. And this is the application that we have thus far being hosted on our local server via Apache. And don't worry, there's no authentication, so if we just click this, again nothing's going to happen, not even if we fill out the information, because all of that authentication will be done with this tutorial. All we've done thus far is just do the views, which you should already know because this tutorial just assumes basic front-end skills. The first step that we will take to give our PHP project an authentication system is we will create a database class. It will connect to our project's database and will be used by all of the models to query the database with PDO and fetch the results, etc. We will create it in libraries because it is not necessarily a part of the MVC architecture, but it is necessary for us to streamline the model's communication with the database. At least it is in vanilla PHP anyway. And this file will only contain PHP code, so we will open up a tag at the top and won't have a closing tag below simply because we don't need one. And it will be a class that we can use its methods and properties, etc. These properties are all necessary data to connect PDO with the database that we have just created for the project. Hence why its name is stored in db_name. As for the host, that is where the database is currently stored, in localhost. And in MySQL, the default username is root, and there is no password by default, meaning that if you haven't set one yourself, then you can set this property to simply be a blank string. But in my case, I have created my own password, which is why I've not used that. As for these fields, they all relate to PDO. DBH will eventually be assigned the PDO object, but if the assignment process is unsuccessful, then error will report the error triggered, and STMT will hold the query that we want to make with PDO. We will initialize the PDO object in the construct method because that is what is called as soon as the class is initialized. Then we will initialize the DSN or data source name. Be very careful here. If you make a syntax error, then PDO will not work. And what we are doing here is essentially concatenating the relevant properties of this class using dots in the places where they should be in this DSN. Then we will configure some PDO properties. We won't go overboard here. ATTR persistent means that we will always check for an existing PDO connection before creating a new one. And ATTR error mode is simply a more elegant way of handling errors in PDO. As for actually initializing the PDO object, we do that in a try-catch block so that we can catch any errors that may arise during this process. Now, in case you don't know how PDO works, any data from the client that we want to use in our SQL queries won't be directly added to the SQL query, because doing that would be a huge security liability and will leave us vulnerable to things like classic SQL injection attacks. Instead, our query, which will be prepared by PDO, will have placeholders in the areas where we want to use data submitted from the user in our SQL query. And since the statement has been prepared with PDO, we will be able to bind the actual data from the user to these placeholders, and that is a much more secure way of doing things, because binding the data formats them so that they won't harm our SQL query. And this is the method that we will use to prepare query with PDO, and it does that because it uses this DBH property, and if this try-catch block goes successfully, then this DBH property will actually be PDO. Now, as for binding the values to this now prepared statement, PDO gives us two ways of doing that: name parameters and positional parameters. For the sake of simplicity, the method that we will be creating to do this will use name parameters, where the placeholders are listed and targeted by their name, not their order. So type will be null by default unless it is manually assigned a value on method call. And if it is null, then we will need to figure out the data type of the value that the user wants to bind to the prepared statement, because unlike PHP, PDO is strongly typed. And we will use a switch statement for that. If none of the above conditions are met, then we will automatically assume that the data being inserted is a string, which it is most likely to be anyway. And once that is out of the way, we will actually bind the given value to the prepared statement. Once the prepared statement has finished being prepared, we will be able to run the query with this method. But if we are querying for a set of data, then it is likely that we want the results returned so that we can work with the queried data in PHP. To do that, we will create these two methods. They will be called instead of the execute method because they call the execute method themselves, and they both return the data as a PHP object. The difference between the two is that the first one will return an array of objects, meaning that it should be used for fetching multiple rows, and the second method will return a single object, the first row found that matched the query, and this is why it uses the fetch method instead of the fetchall method like its contemporary. Finally, this method will tell us how many rows match the query that we just executed with PDO, and this will be the last method in our database class. It is now time that we got onto creating the users table, which will handle all of the users who have registered for a service. So we will click on SQL in our database, and we will write out the command to create a new users table here. The table will have a user's ID column, and that will serve as the primary key, which automatically goes up by 1 and can never be null. As for the other columns, they also cannot be null, and they are all variable characters or strings that can hold no more than 128 characters. And we'll now run this, and we should successfully create the table. As you can see, all the columns are created here. And actually we'll go to our sign up view, the one that displays the sign up forms to the user, and you should be able to see that all these inputs match the names as the associated column of the users table that we just created, and all of these inputs are present apart from the user ID. So there's no input for the user ID because that's the primary key, and it gets automatically generated, and it's just one up from the previous row in the users table. And currently this form sends a post request, but it's not sending it to anywhere as specified by this action attribute. So we will set it to send a post request to this users controller, which we need to create. And to distinguish this post request from other post requests, which might also be sent to the same file, we will add this hidden input to the form. Hidden in the sense that it won't be visible to the user. Its name will be type and its value will be register, because that is why we are sending this post request, to register the user. And as promised, we will create this file in the controllers folder as referenced by our forms action. Its name is plural because it is a controller, and it is the models that need to be written in the singular. The controllers class will have the same name as its file. Inside we will create this method and it will do just that. It will register the user. And we want to call this method in response to a post request from the registration form. And to do that, we will go below the class and we will initialize a new object from the class. Then we will use this server superglobal and its request method field to check to see if the client has accessed this file via a post request. If they have, then we will check the value of the hidden input and we get access to it through the type field of the post superglobal, because remember that hidden input had a name of type. And on the register form that we just created, we gave it a value of register. Therefore, if we are receiving a post request from this register form, we will now call the register method of this user's controller class. Now, this user's controller is responsible for handling data that the user submits through forms, but its ultimate goal is to use this data in communication with the database, and the controller can't do this on its own because that is the role of the model, and so we will create that now. Inside, we will require the database file that we just created, because this model will make use of the database class which is contained inside of that file to make queries, etc. And we will initialize a new database instance on the DB property as soon as this user model is instantiated. And with this model created, we will require it in the corresponding controller so that we can use it inside of this matching controller. Then we will initialize a new instance of the model as soon as this user's controller gets initialized, which happens directly below the class. The first thing that we will do in this register method is we will sanitize all of the data being sent by post on the client. The options that we use inside of this filter input function will remove anything that is deemed unsuitable for the format of a PHP string. Next, we will create this data array. It will hold the values of all of the inputs that the user sent over via a post request other than the hidden input, and they are all trimmed to remove any white space that they might have had. With the data formatted, we will check to see if any of the items in this array are empty. If they are, then we will need to throw an error of some kind because we can't have the user submitting a form that they haven't even completed. And the error that we throw will be manifested in the form of that red box that appeared above the form when an error was triggered, and you saw this at the start of the video. And we will create this effect in a separate file to save us from rewriting the same code ad nauseam. So if we don't specify otherwise, then the message box rendered by this function will be a red error message as determined by this default styling that we created before the video even began. If the name and the message argument are not empty, and we cannot find the corresponding data in the session, which is data that is globally available so long as the session has been started and hasn't ended, then we will store the message in the session under a field with a name matching the name argument, and we will also store the class in the session in a field with a name that is a slight modification of the name argument. If there is no message argument though, and there is still a name argument thanks to this parent if condition, which is else if is inside of, then we will use a ternary operator to retrieve the class from the session if it does exist. If it doesn't, then we will simply use the class argument, which is assigned a value by default in this argument here, and we will use it on the div element, which will then be rendered out with this message retrieved from the session. Finally, we will unset both of these values in the session so that on page refresh the message will be gone because it gets unset as soon as it is shown, and so the previous if condition here will also be met where the specified name on the session is blank, and that needs to happen before they could even assign a message on the session. Actually missed out a semicolon there, so we'll just add it. And for this to work, it is absolutely vital that there is a session running, so we will start a session on this file just in case there isn't one already running. Finally, we will create this extra function. It will simply redirect the user back to the location specified by its single argument, and then stop whatever script is currently running using PHP's built-in header and exit functions. And back in the user's controller, We will need to acquire this to make sure that it works properly. So if the error scenario is met, then we will use the flash function to assign an error message to the session field of register, and then we will redirect the user back to the sign up page. And to actually display this flash message, we'll need to go to the sign up view. We'll need to acquire the same session helper file, and then we'll write the flash function with just this name argument, and it needs to match with the messages set for the relevant function, obviously in the user's controller, so its name is register, and then we'll display all of the register messages here. And now we'll just test this out. So we will go to application, we will say sign up, register, same thing, click sign up, and then obviously we get that message now, but if we refresh, then it's gone. The next error scenario will be if the user has tried to submit a username that contains any characters other than numbers and alphabetical characters in either lower or uppercase. We test this with the pregmatch function straight from PHP. It uses regular expressions, which we don't have time to go into right now, but our error scenario will be triggered if the condition is not met, which is why we have this exclamation mark prefix. We are saying if the username is not comprised of these characters, then throw an error. As for the email, we will throw an error if the user has not inputted anything that resembles the basic structure of an email, and we can detect this with the filter var email setting, which is being used on this PHP filter var function. Again, all of these functions come straight from PHP, so you can look at the documentation for a more in-depth explanation on what these functions really do. The two password inputs will have two error scenarios. The first one will be met if the user has inputted a password that is less than 6 characters, so it is deemed too short. The second one will be met if the user's password does not match the repeated password. And the final error handler, which we haven't created yet, will be if the user has inputted the same email or username as a user that has already been registered with us. And to find this out, we will need to go to the user model to make a query to the users table. So we will create this method, and it will take in 2 pieces of data necessary to make the query. And we will use the database class and the query method that we created for it a while back to make the query where the queried row can match either the email on its email column or the username on its username column. And these values after the colon are placeholders. We are going to bind data to them so that this becomes a legitimate query that we can make with PDO. And this is us doing that. We target the name parameter with the first argument, and then the second argument is the value that we want to take in its place. Then we will execute the query like so, using this single method, because there shouldn't be more than one user who matches this criterion, if any, because that would defeat the whole point of making this error check. So if there aren't 0 rows returned, and well there's more than 0, then we will return the matching row, else we will return false, making the non-error scenario a value of false for this method. And back in the user's controller, we will now use that method that we just created on the user model. And that is why we will throw an error if there is a value from this method, because if there wasn't, then we would catch a statement with an exclamation mark prefix, which would correspond to a false or null, 0, etc. And obviously, these exclamation marks here is what I'm referring to. So if we get to this point, then we have passed all validation checks, in which case we could safely hash the password, because we will soon be storing it in our database and don't want sensitive data like a password stored in our database unprotected. And this is us doing that. We use the password hash function, which is a very secure method which comes from PHP. We will now need another method on our user model where we register the user by inserting their validated inputs into a new row on the user table. We only need a single argument because all of that data was stored in an array, remember? And this is the query that we will make. There are 4 query parameters because we are inserting 4 pieces of data into a 5-column table. 4 values means 4 values to bind to this PDO prepared statement. And we don't need to get back anything from this insertion command So it'll either return true or false depending on whether the insertion was successful or not. And back in the users controller, if all is going to plan with the register method, then we will redirect the now registered user to the login page where they can then log in with the account that they just registered. But if for some reason we failed, then we will simply stop the script with an error message because there isn't a great deal that we can do about that. And so now we should be able to test this out and see that everything's working as intended. So you go to register and then we say, John Doe, and then type in an email. But what happens if we just don't type in a proper email, but then, obviously we fill out everything else? And there is, kind of an error with this, because when we get an error, it's like invalid email, which that was obviously, then we need to retype everything. And there are ways to fix this. In fact, I've actually got a video quite a while back on my channel on how to use local storage to solve this error, but we won't go into it now because this tutorial's already very comprehensive. Can't really cover everything, otherwise it would be like 10 hours long. But anyway, this should be valid now. Our password is just password. We typed it out twice, the same. And then, we're in the login page, so we should have passed all those validation checks. We refresh our users table, and as you can see, even though our password is password, it doesn't appear that way in our table because it's been hashed. It just appears, just hash. And then what we'll now do is we will now do the login. So we will go to our login view, and we'll need to send the user to the users controller when they submit the form, obviously. And to distinguish this post request from the register post request, we're going to need to include the hidden input again. And its value will be login into the register. And just to save us from having to do it later on, we will now include the flash message for this form, even though we haven't actually created any for the form yet. We'll just do it so we don't have to do it later on. And the name for these form flash messages will be login. And now in our users controller, we'll need to handle this post request from the form. From the login form, sorry. And when we do get a post request in the login form, we'll call this login method on our users controller, and obviously you need to create this. So we will begin this login method with the same formula as the previous register method by formatting the data so that it is ready to be inserted into any prepared statements. And just like before, we will throw an error if the user has left either or both of the inputs blank. And if you're wondering where this name/email comes from, that's actually the name of that email, because remember, they can either type in their username or the email. As for this user's PWD, well, that input name is already used on the register form, just in case you were wondering where this came from. We will now make use of a method that we've already created from the user model to query the database for a registered user that corresponds to the data that the user has just inputted on this login form. So if there is no user, then we will throw an error, because obviously they're trying to log into a user which hasn't been registered. But if we know that there is a user who matches the inputted credentials, then we will need to begin the login procedure. And to do that, we'll use this login method from the user model, which we now need to create, which is why we're getting the error. We could actually make use of a previous user model method in this one to find the user who matches either the username or email of the data that was submitted by the client. And if there isn't one or the query failed, then we will return false before continuing with the method, so that an error scenario can be triggered in this login method. But if we get to this point, then we should have found a registered user, in which case we will extract the password, which should have been hashed before it was stored in the database, and we will use PHP's password verify function to check the unhashed password argument with the hashed password to see whether they match or not. If we do, then we will return the queried row, and if they don't, then we will return false, because again we will have another error scenario. And so back in the users controller, if the login does end up being successful and not returning false, then we will pass the queried row into this method. It will store the user's ID, name and email in the session, so that this information can be globally accessible throughout our application, so long as there is a session up and running. You also redirect the user back to the home page, an important thing to note because we want the home page to now show the user's forename as they are logged in. And as promised, we will call that method if we are successful, and this will effectively log the user in. As for getting the home page to display the user's forename, we will say if there is a user ID on the session, then we will split the username up, which should be on the session if that condition is met, and we will split it up by its white space so that we can access the first item from the array. That has now been outputted by PHP's explode function to render out the user's forename with echo. And if there is no user ID on the session, then we will render out guest, because that should only happen if the user is not logged in. And now I'll actually go to the header, and we'll need to change this as well. So if the user is logged in, or sorry, they aren't logged in because this is false, then we will say they will have the option of either signing in or logging in. But if this is else and we are logged in because this is actually set, then we will show this login. So this log out, and clicking on it, it will send the user to the user's controller. But we may want to personalize this GET request a bit more so that we can send multiple GET requests to the same controller that all do different things. To do this, we can add this query parameter to the URL. Its name is Q and its value is logout. We will cover more on how to handle this query parameter from the controller side later on, but for now we will try logging into our account. And so we will just try this out. So we'll type in the wrong information, no user found. Obviously we'll type in no information, and then we'll refresh to get rid of that. And then we'll type in the correct information. Password is password, that's our email. Login, welcome guest. Okay, I don't know why that's. Oh, the reason why this isn't working is because we haven't started. Because on this header, what we need to do is we need to start the session. So that we do that on the helper file as well, but we do it on the header because this is required before the helper, and that only starts if it wasn't started already on the header. So now, well, we should already be logged in because we already started it. We already logged in. Now we just started the session. So now this is working, and as you can see, the navbar has changed as well. And so what we now need to do is to do the logout functionality. But before we do that, we will handle the user's request. So if this file is being requested from something other than a post request, then we will create this switch statement where we examine the Q parameter, which is the query parameter that we set to be logout on the href of the eponymous navbar link. And so if it does equal logout, then we will call this logout method from the user's controller, which we need to create. Else we redirect the user back to the home page because they're trying to access this file in a way which we are not prepared to handle. And we'll also do that for post as well, because we don't have a way of handling any of the other post requests that they might have sent. As for the logout method, it will be very simple. All it will do is delete the session fields that we set in the create user session method, then ensure that this session is completely destroyed, and finally we'll be redirected back to the home page. And so now we'll just demonstrate this real quick. Log out, boom, we're logged out, easy as that. Now that we've done the full authentication system, what we now need to do is the forgotten password feature. And if we go to our login form, you may have already noticed that we've created this forgotten password option, and it takes the user to this reset password view. And on that reset password view, they've got a form where they can type in their email, and then they press the button to receive the email. So what we now need to do is we'll now need to actually go to our database, and we'll need to, so we'll run it from here. We will create a new table, and this will handle the forgotten password. Everything to do with the forgotten password, what's it? So we'll create that table now. And so this is what the table will look like. So we have 5 columns, and we'll only be inputting data into 4 of them though, because this one is the primary key, which is auto incremented. Again, it's already been explained. And then we will run this, and hopefully, it's been created. As you can see here are the columns. Now to actually send an email from PHP, we'll require a mail server. For this tutorial, we'll be using MailTrap, which is a mail server that is specifically designed for development apps, not production apps. That is because the emails don't actually get sent to the recipient when we use MailTrap. Instead, they get sent to our MailTrap account where the intended recipient will be listed alongside each email. This allows us to test multiple emails and ensure that they are all being sent as intended. We will now create an account with them so that we can use their service. Great, so we're now logged in. Obviously I wasn't going to show you my account details. And we'll go to PHP Mailer, which is what we'll be using. And to install PHP Mailer, we'll need to go to this GitHub page. Again, link will be posted in the description. The reason why we're installing it, I mean, you could use the standard PHP mail function, but that is quite low level, and this is much less painful to work with. So we will go to download zip, and then we will go to our our project folder in the HT docs, and then we'll just download it there. And then inside we will extract it. Yeah, we'll extract it like this. Extract to PHP Mailmaster. Obviously, you might be using a different file archiver. So we'll just rename this just for ease, PHP Mailer like that. And then all the files are in there, and that's fine. And we deleted the original archive as well. And once we've got it in our project, what we'll need to do, we'll need to create the reset password controller and the matching model. So we'll create them like so. Remember, following the plural for controllers, single for models, and inside of the reset passwords controller. This controller will make use of both the user and reset password models, along with the session helper file, whose functions were used profusely in the user's controller. Along with that, you'll import these three files required for the PHP Mailer dependency to work, along with this use statement above. The actual controller class itself will have three properties, two for the models that we just imported and one for the PHP Mailer dependency. As is standard, we will initialize the model in the constructor so that they are initialized as soon as this controller is initialized. And we're currently getting an error because although we have actually imported the reset password model, we haven't created the class, so we'll just do that now. Okay, we're no longer getting an error now. As for initializing the PHP Mailer class, again we'll need to go to our MailTrap, and we'll just copy this, and then I don't know about your code editor of choice, source code editor, but in VS Code you can highlight and then press Ctrl D to highlight the next matching text along, and then we'll just target the mail property, and then yeah, this should all be good now. We'll now go to our reset password view, and just like before, we will set the action. It will go to the reset password controller, and we'll have this hidden input that will enable the controller to respond in different ways to different post requests. And as with before, we will create this logic that will handle the different requests being sent to this controller. The value of the hidden input on the reset password form submission that we just set is send, and we will handle that with this send email method which we need to create. We're only taking one piece of form data here, so it is a lot easier to parse and sanitize the incoming data. And as always, we will perform the usual check. We won't explain what it does here because I've already covered what this logic does early on. Our database will store two tokens, the selector, which will be used for querying the matching row on the database, and the token, which will be hashed when stored and validated with the unhashed version to check to see whether the user has the right to set a new password or not. Creating two tokens instead of one multiplies the security by 2. As for how they are created randomly with this random bytes function, which generates a random number of bytes as determined by the number given to the method. As for the bin to hex function, that converts the bytes into hexadecimal. Note that hexadecimal is in hashing, so this won't increase the security of our tokens. We do it because we want an easy way to store these tokens, and bytes is an incredibly impractical format to work with. And we don't convert the token into hexadecimal because we want that stored in our database hashed, not in hexadecimal. We will then create this URL. It'll be the URL that the user will receive in their inbox and can click on to reset their password. The URL here points to localhost, but that will need to be changed obviously if we're hosting our application somewhere else. As for the specific view that they will be pointed towards, that will be the create new password view, which, like all previous views in this application, has already been created. And notice that we have two query parameters here, selector and validator. We have used string concatenation to assign them the values of the matching tokens. We do convert the token variable into hexadecimal here, because otherwise the URL wouldn't be formatted correctly. For security reasons, we want to invalidate this URL after half an hour of its creation date. To do that, we will store the current date plus 1800, which is half of an hour in seconds, to store in seconds since the 1st of January 1970, the time exactly half an hour forward from now. And now we'll need to go to the reset password model. Like with the previous user model, we will require the database class so that we can make basic communications with our database, and we will initialize it in the constructor, so as soon as this model is initialized. With this out of the way, we will create this function. It will take in an email and will delete the row from our password reset table that matches the given email, if one exists of course. Again, I won't explain this in much detail now because we have gone over these principles many times by this point. And back in the controller, we will use this method, because if there was an existing password reset entry on this table that had the same email as the one that the client had just sent to us, then we will need to delete it because we are about to submit a new one, and there can only be one per email. If for some reason this delete query fails, then we will throw an error. Past that, we will hash the token like we said we would and get ready for its storage in the database. And in the model, to insert a new entry into this table, we will create this method in the password reset model. The query made will have 4 parameters because that is how many columns we will be inserting data into when we create a new row in this password reset table. And with this created, we will make the insertion with the data that we have prepared up to this point, and if this insertion was successful, then you'll begin sending the email below this. The message's subject is self-explanatory. As for the message's content, we use HTML for that because we want the message that spans multiple lines, and we can use paragraph elements to achieve this effect. As for this .= syntax, what we are doing here is appending new content to the already existing content in the message variable. The dot ensures us that we are not overriding the already existing content. The final thing appended to the message will be this link tag. Its content will be the URL, and clicking on it will take the user to the very same URL. That is why we have used the string concatenation that we have used. Again, very important that our syntax is correct here. There are lots of room for errors. As for who the email will be from, it doesn't really matter. We could choose any old email, and here we've just decided to use this boss email. Next, we will configure the message's subject and body, but not before setting the email to work with HTML, since that's what we've used. Then we will add the email's recipient, and that is important. It needs to be the email that the user sent to us. Finally, we will send this email, and once sent, the user will be redirected back to the reset password page where they should see a flash message, but this time the message will be green as configured by this third class argument, which is normally omitted because it is assigned the error class unless a specified value is given. And in the reset password view, we'll use the flash message like we always do so the user can actually see the success message. And so now we can test this out. Hopefully it works. So we go click login. Oh no, we forgot our password. We've only created one account, so we'll just type that in right now. And that was the email for this only account that we created. Yeah, we had to wait a bit for the magic to work. And then we go to mail trap. Hopefully, yeah, we should be able to see it now. And then we click on here, and as you can see, it takes us to this view that we've already created. And it's got all the correct query parameters as well, so this is good. And as for this create new password view, here it is here. We want to shake things up a bit. We only want users to be able to see the form if they are visiting this file from a link which contains the 2 token query parameters on the URL. And this will prevent people from accessing this page when they shouldn't be. And so now we will only render out the form with all the other content, header and all, if not only does the URL contain the 2 query parameters as determined by this if condition here, but also if the 2 query parameters are in hexadecimal format as determined by this ctype xdigit function. We return a simple error message if either or both of these conditions are not met. So one here if they are empty, and one here if they're not in hexadecimal format. Again, it is very important that we get the syntax right here. The actual form and these 2 includes should be contained within this child if condition, and we should have this closing PHP tag at the bottom where the semicolon of the parent if condition is closed off and an else condition for the child if condition is made. What we will now do is, along with creating the type hidden input and setting the form's action, which is what we always do, we'll also create 2 more hidden inputs, and the name will correspond to 2 tokens which should be present as query parameters on the URL if you have gotten to this point. The values of these 2 token inputs will simply be the matching token, and that's straight from the URL query parameters, and we assign the variables here. And so now in the controller we will need to handle the post request from this reset password form. And here it is here. Again, we're getting an error because we haven't actually created that yet, so you will create it just so we don't get an error. And I'll just show you real quick that, say, create reset password, well, we're going to move all this now. So could not validate you. Well, that's the error, but obviously if you go back to this link here, then it's working now because that we actually have proper validation to access it in that case. And in this method, we will sanitize and parse the data as we always do. Then we will actually reconstruct the URL that the user should have visited in order to send a post request and call the specific method in the first place. We omit the localhost part here because this URL is for redirection purposes only, and so we don't need it. And as is the standard, we will catch any errors with the inputted data, and if any are met, then we will do what we always do and send the user back to the form with an error message. After, we will extract the current date in seconds to see whether the URL has passed its expiration date or not. And in the password reset model, we will first need to find the row in the password reset table where the selector token matches the one that the user had on the URL and where the expiration date stored on the row is still greater than the current one. We will need to create a method that will determine whether the user can actually reset the password or not. And so you'll first need to find a row in the password reset table where the selector token matches the one that the user had on the URL and where the expiration date stored on the row is still greater than the current date if said row does exist, of course. And so now we'll implement this in the controller. So if there wasn't a row that matched this query as determined by the row count method, then we will need to inform the user of this error. If there is row, then we will use the queried row, which we stored in the above if statement, to check its stored hash token with the same corresponding unhashed token with this already mentioned password verify PHP function. And if they don't match as specified with the exclamation mark, then we will need to catch this error, else we will continue with the password reset process. We will now use the email on the password reset row that we have just queried to see if there is a user from the users table who shares the same email. If there isn't, then we will throw an error because there is no password to reset. And what we'll now need to do, we'll actually need to go to the user model because the actual query to reset the password will be handled on the user model since all of the user's passwords come from the user table to begin with. We are finding the user by their email and are using SQL's set command to change the password to the new password, which is bound to the pwd parameter. And so now that this is created, we can use it in the password reset controller. If we have gotten to this point in the reset password controller's reset password method, then we should now hash the user's new password because the original one was also hashed, and then pass it into the user model method that we just created, which updates the password to the supplied new one. We will finish off the laborious method by deleting the row from the password reset table that we have just used because the user has now successfully changed the password. And then after this, providing that there was no error with that delete email method, then we will redirect the user back to the password reset form with a success message indicating the result. And finally, on this create new password view, we will do the flash message. Okay, and before we test this out, I did notice an error. So basically, the link that I used here was in relation to my test project, but not the one that I'm actually working on. As you could see here, it's got -YT at the end. And so what we're doing is, before I was sending a link to my other project, which it uses a completely different database, and that's also hosted on local server because everything in the web folder is hosted, and basically it was just messing things up. So now so we need to go back to the beginning. Basically, we click reset forgotten password. Well, I've only got one email, well, one registered user, and that's the email that he uses. And so now I've sent, as you can see, I've sent quite a lot now, but if we go back, we should only see one, because remember, we've only allowed one per email, one entry per email. We click on this, it should be the correct link now. Type in the new password, we'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Same with this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And now, okay, we receive email. I don't know why that, oh wait, probably because, what did we do? We said new reset, and then create new password. Okay, we didn't do that. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, so we reset password updated. Okay, now we log in, and then we say, you know, that email, and then we say our old password. It shouldn't work now. Password incorrect. But then if you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then yeah, welcome John Doe. And that's it for this one, guys. I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial, especially if you are new to PHP and are finding it hard with the lack of quality PHP tutorials out there on the internet. Please give me your feedback on whether you want more PHP tutorials like this one or not. And don't hesitate to contact me if you're stuck on anything covered in this tutorial and can't figure it out from the completed GitHub project in the description box below. More importantly though, peace out guys and have a great day.